Hello everybody and welcome back to our lecture series. I'm Ted, your host, and for this lecture we're going to continue with our discussion on world history. Now, as I stated at the end of our last lecture, we're going to deviate from the standard course of world history. That is, we are not going to we are going to sort of hop from continent to continent, first stopping in Africa to examine the rise and development of states in Africa before going to East Asia and doing the exact same thing, and then finally finishing up in the Americas, examining the Americas, the rise of states and developments in America through to the coming of the Europeans, of the Spaniards, at the beginning of the 16th century. To begin with, we're going to start with the rise and development of states in Africa. And let me just start by saying that when we examine African history, we always look at it as a world of interconnectedness. As with all states, as with all civilizations in the world, nobody ever rises or accomplishes much on their own. It's always in conjunction with interacting with the wider world. It's always with joining in with the wider network or associations of neighboring states. And to begin with, let me start by sort of broaching the topic of African history. The origin of states and of civilizations in Africa is often an ignored or it is a subject that is downplayed and put into the background, and this is normally done unconsciously, and it is based on outdated assumptions that African states could not have developed without outside inspiration or direction. And this line of thinking goes back to the 19th century, when the first serious attempts at archaeology and historical analysis were first being conducted. Now, this assumption was rooted in the pervasive belief that African populations lacked the higher order thinking to organize themselves along complex lines and develop states of their own. Now, that thinking is profoundly insulting, and it is inherently wrong. Throughout the continent of Africa, we find archaeological evidence that supports indigenous states being built and complex interregional exchanges. Now, there is also an assumption that indigenous states and urban centers appeared later in Africa than elsewhere, that these states and these urban centers were founded or directed by outside influences, namely Islamic civilization or European colonial powers. What we find in examining Africa and examining the world is that the same process that occurs in other parts of the world occurs simultaneously throughout Africa. We cannot say in any sense that the state building or the complex hierarchy skip regions, or that some regions never experience complex organization. We look at the development of civilization on and around the world, and in particular, to begin with our examination of African history, we will look at the development of civilizations on and around the Ethiopian plateau. And to begin with, let me start by saying that Ethiopia has been home to a distinct cultural identity in Africa over an extremely long period of time. And in part, that is because of their environment. Ethiopian agriculture, which is impacted by the environment, includes a variety of domesticated plants, domesticated plant life that do not appear elsewhere. Teff, Ensete, or the false banana, Nug, Ethiopian peas. These are all unique plant life, domesticated plants that are unique to the region. Now, as we've already seen, agricultural produce and economic potential, they are key determining factors in state development and the fostering of social identities. And those two factors are particularly, they very keenly impact political organization and social differentiation. Now, Ethiopia, just looking at it geographically, Ethiopia laid poised between two very different cultural worlds, and they were to receive influences from the Nile River Valley, from the Nubians and the Egyptians, who they would later fall cultural heirs to, and they also received influences, and they benefited from the addition of the developments in the Arabian Peninsula. Now, Ethiopians absorbed some of these influences while forming their own distinct cultural and distinct social traditions and institutions. Now, the contact with the Nile River Valley was important, and this is because the contact was during the heyday of dynastic Egypt and the heyday of the Nubian principalities, and those two areas were beginning their development in the late 5th to 4th millennium BCE. The political systems along the Nile, they would undergo increasing sophistication, and contact would pass through these two regions at Batana and at Kassala, and those are areas along the in what is now the eastern Sudan. These regions have been surveyed by archaeologists, but they have yielded and they have yielded evidence of agricultural settlements producing cereal crops and herding cattle as far back as the 4th millennium BCE. Now, substantial agricultural settlements from 3500 BCE to 1000 BCE have also been found in this area. And these findings illustrate an ancient and well-established agricultural tradition, and also just a very high level of production that would foster state building, urbanism in this area. Now, some of these sites, like Mahal Teglinosh, sorry about that, which is a site near Kassala, some of these sites are more than 30 acres, and they have deep cultural deposits. And the deep cultural deposits hint at these being substantially long-term, long-lived settlements. Now, the largest of these sites, they display two primary features of great importance. One, they are links in a wide network of exchange that united the Nile River Valley with the Red Sea coast along the Horn of Africa, and they also extend into the network, or the greater exchange network that extended into the Ethiopian highlands. Now, they also display evidence. Pointing towards the evolution of political hierarchy and developments, particularly the developments of social hierarchy in this region. And that's evidenced by burial goods. Now, what we find in examining these centers is that they controlled smaller dependent hamlets, and that points to settlement hierarchy, or the diffusion of urban populations to outlying areas to support their main settlement. We see here an intriguing rise in the development of the sophisticated states in East Africa in the 3rd millennium BCE. Now, in Ethiopia, South Semitic-speaking populations occupy much of northern Ethiopia today, while Cushitic language speakers occupy the rest of the region. Now, these languages, they're both part of the larger Afro-Asiatic language family, and this language division occurred due to the migration of Semitic-speaking populations from Arabia into the Horn of Africa, and this event took place sometime around 2000 to 500 BCE. Now, we know that a language spread and a population movement did occur, but we do not know what the impulses were behind this event. And this poses a quandary for historians and archaeologists who are confronted with the question of considering the development of states and urban centers in East Africa. When we look at the rise and the development of urban centers like Kassala and Batana, we are forced to ask ourselves, were these sites the result of contact from across the Red Sea in Arabia, or were they simply a combination of all the factors that we have been surveying? And some people hold that this is simply a false choice, because we can see that the states were developing in this region due to the genius or the internal dynamics of the native peoples. But it still is a bit of a quandary. It still is a very prominent sort of alternative theory in examining and in piecing together the history of East Africa. Where are these motivations for developments coming from somewhere else, or were they internal? Now, in Ethiopia, developments appear in two separate directions. One would be at Asmara, and Asmara is the capital of modern-day Eritrea, and the other would be in Tigray, and what is now northeastern Ethiopia. By the 1st century BCE, a number of sites that belonged to the Ona culture existed around Asmara, and these were large, permanent villages that were built using stone architecture. Ona sites were built mainly throughout the 1st century BCE, and their architecture and their material culture identified them as indigenous East Africans. And we also find that there are similar artifacts found at the site of Kassala, at the archaeological site of Kassala. Now, the Ona were farmers and pastoralists. They cultivated a mix of Ethiopian cereal crops along with foreign wheat crops, foreign cereal crops like wheat. And when we find that throughout this area at other sites, grave goods indicate that the region was that there was some sort of a wealth differentiation, a social differentiation, because we find grave goods bearing bronze goods, and these bronze goods date all the way back to the 4th century BCE. At Matara and at Keskesi, and also at the urban site of Kohaito, we find these goods. We find these sort of artifacts and this social differentiation. Now, these sites have striking stone architecture. And they also boast of stone steles. And the steles are of the utmost importance to archaeologists, because steles will become characteristic of all of the later civilizations that arise in Ethiopia. Now, in the 1st millennium, we find complex sites in Tigray. We find sites like Yiha that date to around 500 BCE to 100 BCE, and these sites in Tigray, they have not been extensively excavated, and this is due to a lack of archaeologists in the region, and this is also due to the current workload, which is quite heavy for the archaeologists in the region. Now, we do know that these sites are quite large. We know there was some contact with Sabaeans, and the Sabaeans are in Yemen, in southern Arabia. We know this due to the presence of inscriptions that were written down in Sabaean script. Now, the Tigrayan inscriptions present two questions. One being, what was the political system like in Tigray? Was there a hegemonic figure that had the inscription put up? Was this political system organized using Sabaean models, or was it an indigenous system? Now, some archaeologists have outlined a regional state that could have served as a regional power, and this power or this state is given the name Dimit. Others doubt that there is enough evidence to support the existence of a large state in the region. Understanding the political situation will require more research. What we know is that there were large settlements, there were different levels of wealth and social statuses in this region, that the existence of long-distance trade routes implies that the states were not introduced from outside influences, or that the Ethiopians introduced these innovations to Yemen. The long-distance trade coexists between these zones, with long-distance social and economic structures merging to create a cultural milieu of vital importance to the region. Now, in the 1st century, there is an undoubted transition in the region around Axum. Now, the Axumite kingdom would last until about the 8th century, going from the 1st century to the 8th century of the Common Era, or in the outdated ways of tracking time, AD. Now, Axum appears to be a gradually developing city or urban center in the region. Has the region began to develop on a larger, more grander scale. Now, the previous sites continued, especially Yeehaw, and Yeehaw would become an important Axumite center. Really, all of these regional centers would be important Axumite centers. The archaeology conducted at Axum has been devoted to some extent to elite monuments and elite grave goods, and it is difficult to tell how large the urban center of Axum really was. Nor do we know what the population would have been like during the prime years of Axum. In the prime years of Axum would have been the 3rd and the 4th centuries of the Common Era. In the wake of several key events, Now, this was a key period for Axum during the 3rd and the 4th century, during this key period, the influences of the Axumite kings were vast. The Axumite kings controlled parts of Nubia. They made incursions into the Nile River Valley. They added Yemen and parts of Arabia to their domains. And this was the time when Axum's trade networks were at their most sophisticated and extensive. Axum sits on the shores of the Red Sea at a critical junction in the trade routes between Africa, the Mediterranean, India, and China. Now, Axum minted its own coins. And during this period, also during this I don't want to say golden age, but during this key period where several notable events take place in Africa, in East Africa, and in Axum, Christianization occurs. Axum adopts Christianity, and Christianity enters in force in the Horn of Africa. And it is at this point that we will break off our discussion in African history, and when we come back, we will pick up with our discussion and we will begin to examine Axumite trade. As always, I'm Ted. Hit like, subscribe, and comment. And as I'm recording this, the noise in the background would have been the gardener with the leaf blower, and I apologize for that. I'll see you guys next time for we continue our discussion into African history.